Good afternoon. This is Mr. Clemens again this week, having to make a video because we don't have enough time in class. Now we're looking at Chapter 11, starting down with Part 4 on the Women's Rights Movement for Navy Zero-Hour Class. Origins of the Women's Rights Movement. Moral reform. A big part of the Second Great Awakening's appeal was the challenge to change yourself and to make a better world around you. Deeply religious women wanted to help others, especially other women. Middle-class women in New York City founded the Female Moral Reform Society to curb prostitution and to protect single women from moral corruption. Members visited brothels, prayed, and sang hymns. Improving prisons. In the 1820s and 1830s, prisons began to reform. There were two ways prisons reorganized themselves. First, the Pennsylvania system put prisoners in solitary confinement day and night with no contact with anyone else. Now, within 20 or 30 years, they realized that many of these prisoners became insane from no physical contact or human contact with anybody else. The kind of system for prisons that prevailed was this one, started about the same time. The New York, also known as the Auburn system, so named for the prison in Auburn, New York, placed prisoners in solitary confinement at night, and they were allowed to work together during the day. Creating asylums. Dorothea Dix, wow, what an amazing lady, was emotionally abused by an alcoholic father in Massachusetts and wanted to save children from vice. While teaching a Sunday school lesson at her local jail, she was appalled at the conditions. They had both the insane and regular criminals and prisoners and children and all that in the same jail. She became a speaker on behalf of the mentally ill as well as a published author. In 1841, she began a campaign to improve care for the mentally ill. She spoke to nearly every state legislature in the United States and started the asylum building movement to separate the mentally ill from criminals previously held together in prisons. More than half the states built their own asylums after she spoke to them. Wow, this is in a time that women really aren't allowed to speak in public in many ways, and she accomplishes this. Next, expanding education. Horace Mann was appointed superintendent of schools for the state of Massachusetts in 1837. Each year, he issued an annual report to the state legislature, and he demanded better schools. He was a dedicated reformer. He established teacher training schools. Yay! Woohoo! Increased teacher salaries. Double. Yay! Woohoo! Woohoo! And state money for teachers and schools was increased. For schools was increased. During the second quarter of the 19th century, inspired by Massachusetts' example, local and state governments built systems of tax-supported public or common schools. Most of these were what we today would call grammar schools. These schools either went from grades 1 through 4, 1 through 6, or 1 through 8, depending on the state and what the local community could afford. Some could only afford grades 1 through 4. However, grades 1 through 8 eventually becomes the standard grammar school. By the 1830s, Whigs, the anti-Jackson faction, and Democrats' pro-Jackson faction agreed that providing public and common schools was a proper function of government. Reformers who created the most advanced, expensive, and centralized state school systems were Whigs. The Whigs' traditional power base was in the northeastern states, with their power base centered in New York and New England. The Whigs often talked more about character building than the 3 R's. Now, I know this doesn't sound right, but the 3 R's were reading, writing, and arithmetic, even though reading and writing and arithmetic start with only 1 R. But nevertheless, that's what they meant, the 3 R's of education. The Whigs believed that schools' first duty was to train youngsters to respect authority, property, hard work, and social order. Schools taught that social questions could be reduced to questions of individual character. Women supported the school movement of Horace Mann and recruited well-educated women to be teachers. Now let me tell you about these schoolhouses. Most of them were either one-room schoolhouses or two-room schoolhouses. Room 1 would have grades 1 through 4, and room 2 would have grades 5 through 8. Or if it was a real one-room schoolhouse, they had grades 1 through 8 in the same room. Now, it was a large room, almost the size of a small church building, and in this room you would have small desks down front and get larger desks toward the back. So kids would come in and sit at whatever size they were and whatever grade level they were. And the teacher would write on the chalkboard, and they had a chalkboard in those days, all 8 lessons on the board, and kids would come in and start working on them themselves. Then the teacher would work her way or his way up through from the little ones all the way up to the older ones as to what they needed to do and give them help on their lessons. The older kids, once the older kids got finished with their work, they would go down and help the younger kids with some of their things after the teacher worked through with them. That's interesting. Very different from today. Okay, last section here, from black rights to women's rights. Abolitionist women. Women were central to the anti-slavery movement. Former slave Harriet Jacobs wrote Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, describing forced sexual relations. Former slave Harriet Jacobs wrote Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, describing forced sexual relations with her master. Harriet Beecher Stowe in Uncle Tom's Cabin pinpointed sexual abuse of women as profound moral failing of slavery. African-American lecturer Maria Stewart spoke about slavery to mixed audiences, first in Boston. Angelina and Sarah Grimke, in a time when women were not allowed to speak to men's groups in many cases, attacked slavery, argued that women have a claim to equal civil rights. Angelina and Sarah Grimke, remember, they were daughters of Southern plantation owners in Charleston, South Carolina. By 1840, abolitionist women asserted that traditional gender roles resulted in the domestic slavery of women. Wow. In 1840, representing the American Anti-Slavery Society, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, her husband and fellow Quaker...
Please release your sophomore students.
Her husband and fellow Quaker, Lucretia Mott, traveled to England for the World Anti-Slavery Convention. When they arrived, they were told it was only for the men and they would not be allowed to attend. Mr. Cady Stanton went to the meetings, and Elizabeth and Lucretia met quietly and grew frustrated that they were trying to free black people, but they themselves were not truly free. They came home determined to organize for women's rights. Basically, they go to these little tea shops, they walk around in London, and the more they walk around and talk about it, the more angry they get. And they decide, how can we help black people be free if we ourselves as women are not free? That's what starts the women's movement, is the being turned away from the door at this World Anti-Slavery meeting. Last things, Seneca Falls and beyond. During the 1840s, women rights activists devised a pragmatic program of reform, demanding stronger legal rights for married women, including property ownership, which Mississippi, Maine, Massachusetts, and New York adopted between 1839 and 1845. In 1848, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Mott organized...
Please release your junior students. Please release your junior students.
In 1848, Cady Stanton and Mott organized Seneca...
Release your junior.
In 1848, Cady Stanton and Mott organized Seneca Falls Convention, attended by 70 women and 30 men. They issued the Declaration of Sentiments based on the Declaration of Independence. In other words, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men and women were created equal. And then in the place in the Declaration of Independence where they had the king, he has done this, they meant men. All men have done this. Okay? They made a claim for women in public life and criticized the idea of separate spheres, basically saying, Republican mother, up yours. Okay, they thought that women should remain in the private home as mothers and wives. They thought was ludicrous. In 1851, they began an effort to gain voting rights. Susan B. Anthony, 1820 to 1906, a Quaker who argued against women dependence upon men, soon joined them and led the campaign for voting rights at mid-century. Now watch online for the Canvas assignment to have you guys read that and answer some questions about it. Y'all take care and have a good day. Bye-bye.